Hey, what's up? This is Dr. Taylor Crick at the Washington Wellness Center, and today's video is about fats, okay? And about fats and some of the myths about fats, some of the good fat sources, some of the bad fat sources. Let me first say what we're not going to get into is all the differences in the types of fats. Monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, saturated, omega-6, omega-3. We're going to get into it just a little bit, but this isn't just about like what types of fats are out there. It's more like what you need to do. What are the good fats you need to eat? What are the bad fats you need to avoid, and why? So what I want to start with is, the myth that so many of us have ingrained in our heads from, the 80s or, past decades really, because it's getting to be widespread that fat does not make you fat. And the fact that they have the same word in them, right? Like everybody doesn't want to be fat. Everybody wants to lose weight. We live in, the most obese country in the world, etc. So we think that fat is the enemy. And, that happened years and years and years ago. But you take somebody that's of an adult age today, and they still sometimes have trouble wrapping their heads around that fat does not make you fat, that fat does not cause heart disease, that fat, etc. And we're going to talk about it because, bad fats can absolutely cause heart disease, but that fat is not your enemy, that fat is your friend. It's been on the cover of Time magazine, at least 5 years ago, and it's widespread now that fat is good for you, and it's an essential nutrient that you have to have. So one of the things that we teach, is decrease your sugars, but then the second thing is increase your good fats. You need these good fats. So fat does not make you fat is a myth. One thing that I put up on our board just to remind me about is this book called Big Fat Surprise. And this is one of the best health books that I've ever read. And it goes into this myth about fat, and it goes into how it was started. And it was started by a gentleman named Ansel Keys, who was just huge, this huge figure in American nutrition for almost 50 years. And so he basically demonized fat, and especially saturated fat. And I'm not going to go into all the details there, but some of the data that he used was just not accurate. He excluded certain countries from certain studies and included others. And anyway, so this book, Big Fat Surprise, it's by Nina Teicholz, and it is phenomenal. It is really, really good. It is so scientifically based, so evidence-based, that it has had write-ups about it in several major medical journals. Some of the biggest medical journals like the Lancet and like the British Medical Journal have done kind of synopsis on this book, because this book is so evidence-based. And the thing that you get from this book is that fats were unfairly demonized. So unfairly demonized. So everything started changing. And essentially our entire American food supply changed because of this unfair demonization of fat. So they began pulling fats out of things. They used to use like pork lard for cooking oil and things, and then they were able to invent Crisco, and they were able to hydrogenate these oils, which was a huge technological breakthrough. But if you know anything about hydrogenated oils or trans fats, looking back now, it's one of the most detrimental inventions that's ever happened to our health. But so these fats started changing. They started taking out the animal-based fats, more of the saturated fats, and started putting in these chemically man-made fats like hydrogenated oils. And then they started replacing those. And then, when you take fat out of stuff too, you have to change the way that the food tastes, because it really makes it taste nasty. So then you have to put in these fake fats, you have to put in sugars, you have to put in salt, you have to put in artificial sweeteners, you have to put in preservatives. And that's really where kind of food science began, or food engineering. Not genetic engineering, but just food engineering. Whereas if you look on the back of, chips or crackers or something today, there's going to be like 30 different ingredients. and that's not the way that things used to be. So the way that this all started is all linked back to this concept of fat. So fat is not the enemy, fat is actually your friend. Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz is a phenomenal book. Some of the reasons that we need fat. So fat is an essential nutrient. It's really, really, really critical for many different areas of our health and our well-being. One of the big ones is that fat makes all of our hormones. Cholesterol, actually, and cholesterol, that's a whole nother story about cholesterol being demonized and good cholesterol versus bad, and dietary cholesterol. And even the American Heart Association has recently changed their tune on dietary cholesterol and on saturated fat. They'll quietly do it because for years they, demonized cholesterol and demonized saturated fat, and those things are starting to change. But cholesterol is actually the building block of all of your body's hormones. Cholesterol turns into something called pregnenolone, which goes down different pathways to become, stress hormones like cortisol, or become DHEA, which can become estrogen or can become testosterone, and all of our hormones. And we hear so much today about hormonal health. Well, all of your hormones are derived from cholesterol, or all your steroid hormones, I should say, are derived from cholesterol. So having low cholesterol can actually be dangerous. And there's a whole big thing about that. I'm not going to get into the associations or the lack of association between high cholesterol and heart attacks. But mostly the bottom line is that a lot of that has been debunked in a lot of the mainstream science, and it's just not necessarily in the mainstream news. But you can go on and you can research some of those things about, cholesterol, good cholesterol versus bad cholesterol, and et cetera. And really, my take on that is we look at the particle numbers, which gives a more true risk. But anyway, cholesterol is really, really important. The other thing is that when we look at your omega-6s versus your omega-3s, so that is going to determine a lot of somebody's inflammatory profile or their inflammatory status. So I want to explain that a little bit before we get into some more of these good fats and bad fats. So your omega-6s and omega-3s. Now, you need both of them, okay? And they both derive into different things. Omega-6s are really, really important. So to say that like omega-6s are really bad and omega-3s are really good is just not the case. But when you have an omega-6 to 3 ratio that's skewed, it sets you up to go down more of an inflammatory pathway rather than down an anti-inflammatory pathway. And so omega-6 to 3 ratio, your 6s are always a little bit higher. And let's say 1-to-1 to 4-to-1, depending on the tissue and depending on the study and depending on what you read, but 1-to-1 to 4-to-1, so a pretty close ratio. So let's say 4-to-1 omega-6s to omega-3s. Well, what we find in our population is that people are more like 10-to-1 to 20-to-1. And we have run these labs, a lot in the past to look at people's omega-6 to 3 ratios. And at one point in my practice, I just pulled a bunch of like 20 patients' labs and averaged them. And our clinic as our clinic as a whole averaged 20-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3. So the omega-6s, when they are high, are more pro-inflammatory. So it's like gas is pro-inflammatory, right? Water is anti-inflammatory. So you got a 20-to-1 gas to water ratio. You pour that on a fire, right? You got a 1-to-1 ratio. I don't know what would happen chemically, but the water would help balance out the gas. So that's why you hear so much about taking omega-3. So this omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is really, really important for inflammation. So why do we need good fats again? Cholesterol makes all your hormones. So how many people today have hormone imbalances, have hormone issues? The majority. How many people today are inflamed? You know, we hear that inflammation is at the root cause of a lot of our chronic diseases, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, autoimmune diseases. They're all inflammatory. So if your omega 6 to 3 ratio is off, it sets you up to be more inflammatory. So the solution, what we're going to get to, is on one side, you need to avoid some of those sixes, right? And know where they're coming from. But on the other side, you might need to increase your threes and get to the right balance of omega 6s and omega 3s from getting your good healthy fats in a well balanced diet. But so hormone health, a lot of people have that. Inflammation, a lot of people have that. And then the last thing, and it goes back to this this ratio of omega 6 to 3, and it goes back to some other things, but your cell membranes, your cellular membranes. So your body is made up of cells, right? Everything is made up of cells, and each cell has this wall around it. And this wall, based on the work of Bruce Lipton and others, this wall, this cell membrane, is really the brain of the cell. It is what determines if what good things get in, what bad things get out, what hormones can bind and can kind of do some signal transduction and get to the DNA and make new proteins and turn on mitochondria, all these different things. The membrane is the brain of the cell. It's not the DNA. The DNA just holds, or the nucleus just holds the DNA, which is just like a blueprint. But the membrane is really, really, really important for all your cellular health and all of your cellular functions. And this membrane is made up of fats, made up of phospholipids. And so this omega 6 to omega 3 ratio is really, really important for membrane balance and membrane health. All of your organelles inside your cells even have membranes that are made of good fats. So your good fats, the fats that you eat, rather, go on to become you, go on to become your brain cells, go on to become your liver cells, go on to become your heart cells, go on to become pieces of you because they make up this cellular membrane. So if your cellular membrane is comprised of all these bad fats that we're going to talk about, you're going to have bad cellular membranes. You're going to have stiff, you're going to have congested cellular membranes, you're going to have cellular membrane inflammation. And on the other side, you could have omega-3 dominance even, and then your membranes are going to be too fluid. They're not going to be selective enough. And there's different problems on both sides of the coin, but the fats that you eat become your brain, become your cells, become your membranes. So they're very, very important that you're giving your body good building blocks. So first, let's talk about some of the fats that you should avoid. So some of the bad fats over here. First one is maybe conventional meat. Meat is an interesting conversation that, some people will swear that meat is the enemy and that meat is bad for you. And when they do large population studies, that is what they find. But, compare somebody that's in maybe rural China versus urban China, and the person in the rural, it doesn't have the access to the same kind of meat and probably doesn't eat nearly as much meat, doesn't have the same economic status versus the person in the city that has their McDonald's, that has their different fast food, different restaurants, different processed meat. So of course the health is going to be worse of somebody that's consuming more meat in the city, but it's also lower quality meat. There's very few studies, there's no studies that I know of that have taken into effect the quality of the meat. So conventional meat, though, one of the things that they've found is that the omega 6 to omega 3 ratios are astronomical. And so what we do with our meat supply today, we feed them a bunch of grains. Corn and soy are major feed products. And so we feed our cows a bunch of grains. Just like people, they get fat quickly. That's great if you're a farmer, you're going to make more money off of a bigger cow. But just like people, they get sicker quicker too. So then they get pumped full of hormones, they get pumped full of antibiotics. So there's all kinds of problems with our conventional meat. It's inflammatory, it's got hormones, it's got antibiotics, it's filled with grains, it's got glyphosate, it's got a bad omega-6 to 3 ratio, all these different things. But I do think that conventional meat is very, very inflammatory. One of the reasons being the omega-6 fats that are found in it. But a major other source is going to be your rancid oils or bad oils. Now, what I'm referring to there aren't like processed foods, or really what I'm referring to is restaurants. You know, you go out to a restaurant, and let's say you even order, like, you know, you're going to be healthy, and you order, you know, vegetables like like skillet sautéed vegetables or something. Well, what are they sautéed in? You know, they're not using coconut oil, they're not using avocado oil, they're not using olive oil, they're not using grass-fed butter or something. They are using some vegetable oil or something bad. Or you think about fried food from a restaurant. We mostly know that fried foods are bad. But you think about the oil that the restaurant is using, these low quality oils that they bought like a huge tub of from the lowest bidder, and the oil probably hasn't been changed since, you know, 2 weeks ago. And you know, so these restaurant foods, you have to be really careful of their oils. You have to be really careful of rancid oils, because when oils oxidize, they go bad, and then there's a huge bigger concern to your health. The biggest concern, though, I would say the number one concern when it comes to our bad fats are our vegetable oils. Those are in nearly everything. And I'll tell you why. You know, we live in Illinois, drive down the road, and what do you see for hours and hours and hours? Corn and soy, right? And so we subsidize these things as a government, so we have a ton of them. So when we discover that we can make oil out of them, it's like, oh my gosh, we can make this really cheap oil, we can use it in everything. So it's in everything processed, everything packaged, everything boxed is going to have these oils. Sometimes they are hydrogenated, but that, you know, there's been regulations, you know, in the past 5-10 years to take trans fats out of foods and have no trans fats. Now, there is some labeling confusion there, that they can actually still put 0 trans fats on the label as long as it's less than a certain amount. So what you want to do is you want to flip over your label and look at the ingredients. Is there a hydrogenated oil? First off, avoid that like the plague. Anything that says hydrogenated, partially hydrogenated, is a trans fat no matter what the label says. But then, is there vegetable oil? And it's in everything. So we look for things like canola oil. We look for things like corn oil. We look for things like soybean oil for several reasons. One, all 3 of those are genetically modified. Canola comes from the rapeseed, and the rapeseed is genetically modified. You know, there aren't that many genetically modified foods. There's only like maybe 10, but those are 3 of them. Cotton is another one, and cottonseed oil is very common. So they can produce these, but then what they have to do is, you know, there's a whole backstory about the processing of these. They're just very highly processed. And I'll give you an example of, like, you take a kernel of corn and compare and think about pressing that into an oil versus an olive. You know, you can press an olive into an oil with your hand, but the corn and these seed oils, they are very hard, and so they require a lot of processing to get them. They use a solvent, a petroleum-based solvent like hexane to help with this process, and then they have to use a very high heat to extract this oil. And when you use a high heat, the oils get rancid. And so these vegetable oils, going back to my point, these vegetable oils, you know, they sound healthy, like it's vegetables, right? It's derived from vegetables, but it's not the same as like eating vegetables with good fiber and phytonutrients and things like that. These vegetable oils are very inflammatory. They're easily damaged. They're very high in omega-6s. Some of these ratios are off the charts, like 300, 600 to 1 as far as the ratios. Some of them are just exclusively omega-6s. They're often damaged, they're processed, and they're just really, really bad. So if there's one bad fat to avoid, it's avoid vegetable oils. Throw out your Crisco, throw out your vegetable oil at home, but also start flipping over your labels, start asking your restaurants, start looking into this a little bit more, because you're getting them from everywhere. They're everywhere in our diet today. So we want to avoid those. Now, if we're eating real food, we should already be avoiding some of those, but you might be eating conventional meat, or you might be eating at a restaurant, or you might think vegetable oil is a real food because it has the word vegetable in it. But here are some of the good fats that you want to begin to increase. You can have good fats with every meal. We don't encourage a super high fat diet, because even on a ketogenic diet, you're going to be higher fat, but you should also be high fiber is what I'm getting at. High fiber, high phytonutrients, high plant density, high nutrient dense, anti-inflammatory, even if you're on more of a lower carb, higher fat diet. So increase these foods in your diet. Avocados are great, and avocado oil I put on there also. So avocados, you could slice those up and have them with eggs in the morning. You could put them in a smoothie. They really thicken up a smoothie. You can slice them onto a salad. You could have them with almost every meal. I sometimes get sick of avocados because we do have them, so often. A lot of people like them to just, sprinkle some sea salt and eat it with a spoon. I don't. But avocados, they've got fiber. It's a whole food. So it's just a phenomenal food. It's a monounsaturated fat. And it's just a really, really good source of good fats. And avocado oil has a very high flash point. So when we talk about cooking, avocado oil is very, very stable and has a high flash point. Another good monounsaturated fat is olives. Eating olives, it's part of a Mediterranean diet. Olives, olive oil, which the big fat surprise really goes into the Mediterranean diet if you want to know everything about that and how it got popularized. And it's like, they'd host these seminars in the Mediterranean and, put people up in beautiful places and teach them about this diet. And anyway, it's a long story, but olives and olive oil. I think that olive oil is a superfood. I think that it could be used on so many things, drizzled over food. I do cook with it. I've changed recently based on some work by Dr. James Nicolantonio. The olive oil, I do believe, is stable even at a high heat. So I've been cooking with it more recently. But olive oil is just, phenomenal. Some people have said that, broccoli is just a vessel to get olive oil into your body. So putting olive oil on everything is really, really good. Olives also just a great source of good fats, and a plant-based fiber, phytonutrients, other things coming from olives. Coconut, another great plant-based. Now that's a saturated fat. But what we're finding is that saturated fat is not the enemy. And that's not the purpose of today's video, of course. But it's you can Google it and you'll get hundreds and hundreds of articles because people have flip-flopped on this about whether or not saturated fat is really good or bad. And the most convincing evidence is that saturated fat is really, really good for you when it's coming from the right sources. Now, I'm not saying you should have an all saturated fat diet, but I think that it's something that you do not need to be careful about. So a good plant-based saturated fat coming from coconut products, coconut flakes, coconut oil, coconut like MCT oil is kind of a derivative of coconut oil, a little bit more processed by the time you're extracting the MCTs. But coconut products are a staple in a lot of paleo type diets. Cooking with coconut oil is very stable and it's just a really, really good one. So that's a high flash point also, coconut and coconut oil. But then we get into some other whole foods like wild caught salmon or other cold water fish. That could be mackerel, sardines. I didn't put any shellfish on there, even though they are good sources of omega-3s. but shellfish are kind of a gray area. But your mussels, your shrimp, your lobster, your crab. I'm not a huge proponent of shellfish, but when it comes to good fats, they do have a lot of good fats. But those cold water fish, especially, because fat helps protect them. Salmon is the best. Wild caught salmon, never farm raised. Wild caught salmon is a great source, one of the best sources, if not the best source, of dietary omega 3s. One of the other sources, though, is going to be the next one. It's chia and flaxseed. And so chia and flaxseed, they contain the omega 3 fat ALA, which is alpha linoleic acid. And ALA needs to be converted into EPA and DHA. And I'll tell you, if you're a vegetarian or a vegan especially, that conversion does not happen very efficiently. I've seen it estimated maybe 10% of that ALA gets actually converted into EPA and DHA. So you need a lot more. You're not going to fulfill your omega-3 needs just through chia and flax, but they're a great thing, fibrous, just really good. Now we sell like a vegan algae oil, an algae-derived omega-3 EPA and DHA. So that's kind of an interesting thing, that you can get these omega-3s from plant-based sources, but it's a little bit different. But flax and chia. In that same conversation with a lot of the seeds, a lot of other seeds too, great fat sources, sunflower seeds, etc. But then we move into our nuts. Cashews, almonds, macadamia nuts, walnuts, great for the brain. Just all the good nuts, pistachios, not peanuts. I wouldn't say peanuts are more of a legume. Peanuts have more of a potential inflammatory component to them. And some of these seeds, nuts and seeds, you get into a lectin component. But we're talking about good fats here. Nuts and seeds are a great source of good fats from a plant-based source. Another one is grass-fed meat and dairy with a question mark. So grass-fed meat, we already covered that when we talked about conventional meat. It doesn't mean that you need to be a vegetarian or vegan, although I'm fine with that as long as you're fulfilling some of these requirements. But the solution isn't to just avoid meat. The solution is to avoid conventional meat. Go with your grass-fed. When they've studied grass-fed animals, they find that ratio is more appropriate because guess what? They're eating the diet that they're supposed to be eating, so their omega-6 to omega-3 ratio isn't nearly as skewed. So grass-fed meat, that could also include butter and ghee. Butter and ghee are great sources of good fats, great sources of butyrate, short-chain fatty acids, and just great sources of fat in general. Now, I put a question mark by dairy. Butter and ghee are often not associated with other dairies because some of the proteins have been removed, and butter is one step better than conventional dairy, and then ghee is even a step further as far as an inflammatory component or immune response component. So butter and ghee, great to cook with. Lard, I don't use lard, but great. We sell lard upstairs, so we do some duck lard, we do some bison tallow, and those are great to cook with. But dairy, I'm not a proponent of dairy. So I'm not saying to go out and get all your good fats from drinking a bunch of milk. It can be inflammatory, it can be an immune stimulator. So just be careful. If it's grass-fed, if it's organic, then like a lot of your cheeses could be raw, grass-fed, organic, and cheeses, get a thumbs up for me oftentimes. Milk, very rarely. If you've got a raw milk source, yes, but otherwise something that I just tend to encourage people to avoid. But a great source of good, healthy fats. And then lastly, free-range eggs. So getting free-range eggs, local farmer would be phenomenal. Otherwise, free-range is best, cage-free is better. Conventional, I would just completely stay away from. And with the eggs, it's the yolk that's going to be the good fat part. So throughout the 80s, throughout the 90s, egg whites got really popular, right? Because they didn't have cholesterol and they just had a good source of protein, and they are the good source of protein. But what we now know, like in the autoimmune world, is the proteins are what are inflammatory. The proteins are what the body can trigger, and through molecular mimicry and loss of oral tolerance can kind of kickstart this autoimmune cascade. And the fats are the more benign part. So if there's a part to eat it is the yolks, it is the cholesterol, it is that good fat. But eating the whole egg, I think, is a phenomenal thing. I think that good quality eggs can be a superfood. But I think that fats are a really, really, really important thing. You need to cut out sugar out of your diet, but step two that you have to do is you have to start increasing your good fats to replace the calories that are lost from the sugar, but also for healthy hormones, for healthy cell membranes, for a healthy brain, for healthy childhood development, and for healthy metabolism. I think it's really, really important that you have a lot of good quality fats in your diet.